300 years ago, 60 million bison thundered across North America. Then, men with rifles and a deliberate government campaign to starve native nations of their main food source did something almost unthinkable. By 1889, the number left standing was 541. The wild population inside Yellowstone, the last free-roaming herd on the continent, dropped to 23 animals. 23. That is not a typo. That is the entire genetic future of an animal that once blackened the plains from horizon to horizon. For decades, the story of the American bison read like an obituary. Then one man, a cable television billionaire with no ranching background and a habit of saying whatever came into his head, decided he was going to bring them back. Not a few hundred. Not a symbolic herd for a nature reserve. 51,000 bison spread across 2 million acres in 7 states. Today, that man is credited with owning roughly 10% of every bison alive on Earth. For 30 years, Montana ranchers thought he was out of his mind. This is the real story of how Ted Turner built an empire the cattle industry swore would fail, and what actually happened to the land and the animals once it didn't. Before we get into it, if documentary-style deep dives like this are your thing, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because we're about to get into the part of this story almost nobody talks about, the legal fight over who actually owns America's last wild bison. You will not want to miss it. All right, let's get into how this whole thing started. Turner didn't set out to build a wildlife empire. In 1989, by his own account, he came to Montana mainly to go fishing. He wasn't scouting ranch land, and he definitely wasn't planning to buy over 100,000 acres. But that year, he purchased a spread called the Flying D Ranch, sitting between the Gallatin and Madison rivers just outside Bozeman, and it would eventually anchor a land empire worth millions of acres. The obsession, though, started decades earlier, and it's a detail most coverage of Turner completely skips. When he was about 10 years old, he read an article in National Geographic magazine about how close bison had come to disappearing forever. He later said, that moment planted an idea in his head that if he ever got the chance, he would do what he could to bring them back. He didn't act on that idea for a long time. His very first bison purchase came in 1976, more than a decade before he owned a single acre of ranch land, just a handful of animals kept simply because he liked looking at them. The empire that eventually reached 51,000 animals across 2 million acres started as a curiosity on a Florida property, tied to a promise a 10-year-old boy made to himself while reading a magazine. Here's the part almost nobody mentions. The Flying D wasn't some pristine, untouched wilderness waiting for a rich guy to rescue it. It had a hard-working history. Back in 1910, a rancher named Charles Anthony II teamed up with the owner of the Yellowstone Park Transportation Company, and together they built one of the largest cattle operations in the American West. At its peak, that ranch ran 14,000 head of cattle across more than 400,000 acres of leased and deeded land. It had its own townships, its own school districts, even its own church. For most of the 20th century, it was cattle country through and through. By the time Turner bought it in 1989, decades of heavy grazing had worn the land down. Multiple accounts from that era describe it plainly. The Flying D had been overgrazed, so Turner did something that, to the ranching community around him, looked like financial suicide. He sold off the cattle, all of them, and he started filling the land with bison instead. This is where the 30 years of being called crazy actually begins. Mike Clark, who ran the Greater Yellowstone Coalition and knew Turner for nearly 4 decades, remembers it bluntly. Buying that ranch, he said, pissed off every rancher in Montana. Turner didn't help his own case. He was openly critical of cattle, calling them poorly suited to the western landscape compared to bison, which is not exactly a popular opinion to broadcast in the middle of cattle country. State law didn't make things easier either. Montana classified bison as livestock, which meant Turner was legally required to fence in an animal he was trying to set free. He wanted wild herds roaming open land. Instead, he got miles of fencing and a decade of friction with regulators. Then there was the marriage. From 1991 to 2001, Turner was married to actress Jane Fonda, whose Vietnam-era activism was still a raw subject across rural Montana. Local radio stations spun outlandish rumors, including one claim that Turner was flying wolves in by helicopter to reintroduce them onto his land. None of it was true, but it tells you everything about how deeply suspicious the community was of this outsider who showed up, kicked out the cattle, and started talking about rewilding the West like it was a business plan. And in a strange way, it was. Now here's the part of the story that almost never makes it into the highlight reel, and it's the moment Turner's bison obsession stopped being a quirky billionaire hobby and became a genuine legal fight over who owns America's wildlife. In January of 2010, 88 bison from Yellowstone National Park were facing slaughter. The reason was brucellosis, a bacterial disease that can cause cattle to lose their calves, and government policy at the time called for killing bison that tested positive, or in some cases, killing them just to prevent the disease from spreading to nearby cattle herds. These were not ordinary bison. They were direct descendants of the last truly wild bison lineage in North America, the 23 animals that survived the population collapse of 1902. Turner stepped in with an offer. He would house and care for the animals on his ranch for 5 years, while officials figured out where they could permanently go. But there was a catch. In exchange, he wanted to keep up to 90% of any calves born during that time. This did not sit well with everyone. A local rancher named Dennis Tilton, who had spent a year feeding these same bison under a government contract, called the deal what he believed it really was, robbing from the public domain. Because these were not private cattle. They were, in a very real sense, public wildlife, animals belonging to the American people. And now, a private billionaire was negotiating to keep the majority of their offspring for himself. The fight went to court. Turner won. The final agreement, brokered with Montana's governor, let him keep 75% of the calves born during a 5-year brucellosis quarantine study. And just like that, Ted Turner became the first private individual in American history to legally own descendants of wild Yellowstone bison, the closest living link to the animals that survived the near extinction of the species. He didn't just build a big herd. He carved out a legal claim to a piece of the last wild bison genetics on the entire continent. But that's not even the strangest hidden detail in this story. Buried inside Turner's total herd of 51,000 animals are 2 separate bloodlines he keeps deliberately isolated from all the rest. One is that Yellowstone lineage. The other is something almost nobody has heard of, called the Castle Rock herd. When Turner bought Vermejo Park Ranch in New Mexico back in 1996, it came with a small legacy herd that had apparently been living on the property since the 1920s. Decades later, genetic testing revealed something remarkable. This herd carried DNA connecting back to 4 of the 6 foundational bloodlines that every modern bison on Earth descends from. Even more importantly, testing showed the herd was completely free of cattle DNA. That matters more than it sounds like it should, because in the 1800s, ranchers frequently crossbred bison with cattle, sometimes on purpose, sometimes by accident, contaminating bison genetics across huge portions of the continent. The Castle Rock herd somehow avoided all of that. So underneath the commercial operation, underneath the restaurant supply chain and the hunting permits, Turner was quietly running what amounts to a genetic preservation vault. 2 separate protected bloodlines, kept apart from his other 50,000 animals, specifically to protect what might be the closest thing left to pure, uncontaminated wild bison genetics in North America. If you're finding this as wild as I did researching it, do me a favor and drop a comment telling me which part surprised you the most, the Yellowstone bison fight or the hidden Castle Rock bloodline, because honestly, there's a lot more where that came from, and it helps this video reach more people who'd find it genuinely interesting. Now let's talk about what actually happens to land once 50,000 bison start living on it, because the science here surprised even the skeptics. For most of the 20th century, the assumption in ranching country was simple. Grazing animals are grazing animals. A cow and a bison eat grass, and one is basically as good for the land as the other. It turns out that assumption was wrong, and the research backing that up is more recent and more specific than most people realize. A study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2022 directly compared bison grazed grassland to cattle grazed grassland and found something significant. Land grazed by bison consistently showed greater plant diversity. Part of the reason comes down to diet. Bison eat mostly grass. Cattle eat a broader mix that includes more broadleaf plants, which changes what's left behind to grow. But there's a physical factor too. Bison wallow. They roll around in dirt, creating shallow depressions across the landscape that fill with water and create tiny pockets of habitat that cattle simply don't produce. Over enough acreage and enough years, those small disturbances add up to a more varied, more resilient ecosystem. A separate study out of South Dakota compared bison grazed shortgrass prairie against cattle grazed land under both light and heavy stocking. The bison grazed land had 2 to 3 times more available forage biomass, better water absorption into the soil, fewer invasive plant species, and significantly less bare, exposed ground. In plain terms, the land was healthier by nearly every measurable standard. And there's a ripple effect here that almost nobody connects back to bison, but it's one of the most interesting parts of this entire story. Prairie dogs evolved alongside bison for thousands of years. Bison keep grass short through grazing, and prairie dogs need that short grass to spot predators coming from a distance. Healthy bison country is, almost automatically, healthy prairie dog country. And prairie dogs matter because of what depends on them. The black-footed ferret is one of the rarest mammals in North America. It was declared extinct not once, but twice during the 20th century before it was rediscovered in the most unlikely way imaginable. In 1981, a ranch dog in Wyoming brought a dead ferret home and dropped it on its owner's porch. That single moment led biologists to a small surviving population, and from there, a captive breeding program that still exists today. Black-footed ferrets depend almost entirely on prairie dogs, both as their main food source and for the burrows they live in. Turner's Endangered Species Fund built one of the first ferret breeding and conditioning facilities back in 1998 on Vermejo Ranch. Over the following 15 years, prairie dog colonies on Turner's properties expanded from a few thousand scattered individuals to nearly 250,000. In 2012, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recognized the Turner Endangered Species Fund with its Recovery Champion Award, calling it one of the most significant public-private conservation partnerships in the world. Think about what that actually means. A billionaire brought back bison largely because he loved them as a kid reading a magazine article. That single decision restored grassland health, which brought back healthy prairie dog populations, which created the conditions for one of the most endangered mammals in North America to have a fighting chance at survival. None of that was the original plan. It was a byproduct. Now let's talk about scale, because the numbers here are genuinely hard to comprehend. Turner's ranching operation eventually spread across roughly 2 million acres, precisely 1,910,585 acres, spanning 13 to 19 ranches in 6 or 7 different states, plus additional properties in Argentina. His single largest ranch, Vermejo Park in New Mexico, covers 920 square miles. That makes it the largest privately owned contiguous piece of land in the entire United States. At even a conservative valuation of $1,000 an acre, that puts the total worth of his land holdings north of $2 billion. Most experts agree the real number is considerably higher once you account for the massive, unbroken tracts and the decades of conservation investment poured into them. The bison herd itself grew to somewhere between 45 and 55,000 animals, with 51,000 being the figure Turner's own company has cited most consistently in recent years. At various points, that meant Turner personally controlled roughly 11% of every bison alive on planet Earth. One man, one herd, 11% of an entire species. But turning bison into a business wasn't just about ego or hobby ranching. In 2002, Turner partnered with restaurateur George McCarrow to open Ted's Montana Grill, a restaurant chain built specifically around bison meat, eventually growing to around 40 locations across 14 states. And here's the counterintuitive twist. Turning bison into a commercial food product is widely credited, including by people inside the bison industry itself, with actually saving the species' genetic diversity, not threatening it. Once there was real money in raising bison, more ranchers across the country got into the business, which spread the gene pool across far more herds and far more land than conservation efforts alone could ever have achieved. The National Bison Association has openly credited Turner's ranches with generating research and herd management knowledge that the entire American bison industry still relies on today. Turner also turned several of his properties into something closer to a working safari than a traditional ranch. Vermejo, Ladder, Armendaris, and Sierra Grande were rebranded as Ted Turner Reserves, offering paying guests guided tours to watch bison migrations up close, with the revenue funneled straight back into conservation work, including bighorn sheep recovery and native cutthroat trout restoration. And in a twist almost nobody saw coming, some of that land eventually made its way back to Indigenous ownership. In January of 2016, the Osage Nation purchased Turner's 43,000-acre Bluestem Ranch in Oklahoma, land Turner had originally bought in 2001 specifically to raise bison. It's a rare case of land, moving from a billionaire's private conservation empire directly into tribal hands. It wasn't all smooth expansion, though. In 2001, a mysterious bacterial disease called Mycoplasma bovis, unique to bison and still not fully understood by scientists, began spreading south from an outbreak in Saskatchewan. Mortality rates in some affected herds climbed past 50%. In 2007 alone, Turner's ranches lost 380 breeding females in Nebraska and 520 breeding females in Montana. Nearly 1,000 core breeding animals wiped out in a single year. Turner's operation partnered with veterinarians, universities, and a private lab in Minnesota to help develop a vaccine, quietly becoming a major funder of modern bison veterinary science in the process. Step back and look at the full arc. 60 million bison reduced to 541, a wild population that bottomed out at 23 animals in Yellowstone. And from that genetic wreckage, one man's herd alone grew to 51,000, spread across 2 million acres, restoring grassland health, saving one of the rarest mammals in North America as an accidental side effect, and reshaping an entire industry along the way. Ted Turner died on May 6, 2026 at the age of 87 after a long battle with a condition called Lewy body dementia. He passed peacefully, surrounded by his family. His media empire, CNN, TNT, the Atlanta Braves, will likely be what most obituaries lead with. But out in Montana and New Mexico and Nebraska and South Dakota, something else is still standing. The ranches are still operating, the herds are still grazing, the prairie dog colonies are still expanding, the genetic vault hidden inside 2 isolated bloodlines is still protected exactly the way he set it up. Turner Enterprises has confirmed the land will remain intact, undeveloped, and unsold, protecting the vision he spent 30 years fighting for, often against the very community he was trying to live in. So, was he crazy? For a long time, plenty of Montana ranchers would have said yes without hesitation, but look at what's actually standing today. 51,000 bison, 2 million acres that will never be subdivided or paved over. A once endangered species pulled back from the edge, twice. An entire industry reshaped around genetics he personally helped preserve. Maybe the real answer isn't that Ted Turner was crazy. Maybe he was just 30 years ahead of everyone else. And it took the rest of the world that long to catch up. If this story changed the way you think about bison, or about what one stubborn person with enough conviction can actually build, subscribe for more deep dives like this one. We cover stories like this every week. And before you go, let me know in the comments, Do you think history will remember Ted Turner as a visionary or just a very, very lucky billionaire? I read every single comment, so don't be shy. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.